Hello and welcome to the Espresso Insiders podcast. Today I'm going to run you through 5 tips to help you transform the way that you make coffee at home. If you're a coffee lover like me, I'm sure you'll find these tips useful, and there's plenty more you can find at espressoinsiders.com. But before we get into that, I wanted to give you an introduction to the podcast, why I've started one, and what you can expect over the next few episodes. So the reason I started the podcast is that it gives me an opportunity to talk about coffee in a little bit more of a long form manner, more so than doing short form content on various social media platforms like TikTok, Instagram, YouTube Shorts, etc. And whilst I'll be producing some shorter form episodes like this one, this is also a great opportunity to discuss with industry professionals like coffee shop owners what makes them tick, why they got into the coffee industry, and actually take you behind the scenes of how you get a coffee bean from farm to cup. This is really important to me because I think sometimes we take coffee for granted. It's such a complex drink and it's actually very cheap compared to something like wine. When you consider how much processing and labour is involved in getting a single coffee bean through the production process and into your cup, it's quite amazing that coffee is actually sold for such a low price. You can find out more information at espressoinsiders.com, which is my website. The reason I've called it Espresso Insiders is not just because of my love for espresso, but actually because I think espresso is such a small drink with so much behind it. But what I want to do is demystify some of the secrets and the tips and tricks behind making great coffee. And in the beginning, I want to really help you avoid making bad coffee, because I think you can go to the nth degree of trying to perfect and dial in, especially your espresso, but also filter coffee. I think this is really useful, but I think it's also very easy to fall down the rabbit hole of trying to optimize everything, and you can spend a lot of money and a lot of time on coffee brewing, when actually, if you just avoid some simple mistakes, you can level up your coffee game very quickly. So with that being said, hopefully you enjoy this episode and many others to come. If you have any feedback for me or any ideas for future episodes, be that topics to cover, someone I should get on to the podcast, or any just general feedback of how you think the episodes are going, feel free to let me know in the comments below. So without further ado, let's jump into 5 tips that will help you transform the way that you make coffee at home. Okay, the first tip, which might sound quite obvious, but actually is so often overlooked by coffee enthusiasts at home, is using filtered water over tap water. Now, this might sound like overkill because, oftentimes people fill up their kettle from the tap, stick it on and pour it over their instant coffee in the morning, and they're happy with that. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, and I'm all for simplicity, but using filtered water is actually going to make quite a big upgrade to your coffee in the morning. The reason for this is that actually, when you think about it, water makes up between 95 and 99% of what you're actually drinking. So if you can improve the quality of that, you're obviously going to improve the quality and the taste of the overall drink. Now, depending on where you live, some places have quite hard tap water, which means they have a lot more impurities and minerals in it. And whilst that might not be a big deal if you're drinking it out of the tap, it can actually impact the way that your coffee tastes. Especially when you start getting into buying more expensive or higher quality coffee, you really don't want to be diluting that flavour down with any impurities that you'll be finding in your tap water. So what I would suggest is buying a filtration system that you can either fit on your tap, you can get them off Amazon, etc., or a filter jug, which is what I use. So you can get a Brita filter jug, for example. There's lots of other brands out there. And I just put my water through that before I put it in the kettle, which helps especially if I'm making pour over filter coffee. But also I use filtered water exclusively in my espresso machine. So not only does this help improve the taste, but it also helps reduce the buildup of limescale, both in your coffee and your espresso machine. Okay, the second tip to help you improve your coffee brewing technique at home is to use fresh coffee beans as much as you can. Now, obviously, this also requires buying a grinder, and depending on how much time and effort and budget that you have to invest in coffee, this might not be suitable for you. But if you can afford it and you think it's worth putting the effort in, then definitely buying a grinder and using fresh coffee beans will make a huge difference to the way your coffee tastes. Now, without getting too deep into it, because obviously I'll be doing other episodes on grinding specifically, and it's a whole deep topic in itself, the long and short of it is the closer you can drink your coffee to when you've ground it will basically preserve the freshness as much as possible. So if you buy pre-ground coffee from the shop, be that the supermarket, etc., because it's been ground and could be sitting on the shelf for a number of months before you actually drink it, basically it's not going to be as fresh or have as many of those underlying flavors as it would do if you ground it fresh before you drink it. So you can invest in a small hand grinder or an electric grinder, and that's a whole topic in itself. So I'm not going to get into the detail of which type of grinder you should get in this episode, but a very small tip that will help you is always go for a burr grinder rather than a blade grinder if you can. They're much better and much more consistent when it comes to grinding coffee well, so that's what I would recommend. That being said, not only should you buy whole coffee beans, but also buy them fresh. Most supermarkets won't actually offer you completely fresh coffee beans because they obviously need to be sitting on the shelf for a longer period of time, and that's the way their business model works. So what I'd recommend is going to a small coffee roastery, be that online or in person, and you'll get coffee beans that have been roasted within a number of weeks rather than them sitting on a shelf for a number of months. Not only are you going to get fresher coffee, but it's most likely going to be a much higher quality grade, so therefore you're going to get a much better product even if you are paying slightly more for it. This is one of the biggest upgrades you can make to your coffee brewing game at home, and despite it taking a little bit more time and effort, is well worth it. The third coffee tip that will help you transform the way you make coffee at home is choosing the right brewing method for your schedule. Now, I think this is something that is so often overlooked by coffee lovers at home because they just don't factor in how much time they actually have in the morning, for example, when they're trying to make their coffee in a rush, or how much effort is required and the technique required to maximize the taste out of a particular brewing method. Now, again, this is something I'll dive into in future episodes, but I think you've got to factor in not only the time you've got, but also how much effort and technique is required to maximize the taste out of the brewing method you're using. So, for example, everyone jumps into getting into espresso because they think that's exactly what I'm going to get from my local barista and I want to replicate that at home. Now that's all well and good, but what you've got to factor in is there's a huge difference between commercial and smaller home espresso machines. Now, I'm not saying you should avoid espresso, and obviously a site being called Espresso Insiders, I'm going to advocate for espresso all day long. But I do think that one, if you've not got much time in the morning, and if you're anything like me, before you've had your cup of coffee in the morning, you're really not switched on enough to master the puck preparation, distribution of grounds, dosing, etc. that's involved in making great espresso. Personally, I'd sooner go for something like an AeroPress or a V60, just to make sure that I'm getting the best bang for buck in terms of taste and flavour with the least effort required in the morning. If you're using a brewing method that requires a bit more preparation, brew time, effort and skill, so for example something like a mocha pot, espresso, and even a French press, which is a very simple brewing method but actually requires a bit longer brewing time than something like an AeroPress, for example, maybe reserve these for the weekends. Trying to rush these brewing methods in the morning when you don't have much time and you're in a bit of a fluster is really not going to get the best results. Okay, the fourth tip to help you improve your coffee brewing at home is to use the right grind size. Now, we've already mentioned grinders and grind size in this episode already, but you can find guides online, there's loads of them out there, to see which of the brewing methods you're using and selecting a fine, medium or coarse grind size for that particular brewing method. Now, this is not an exact science and it definitely takes some dialing in regardless of which brewing method you're using. But what I'd recommend is, as a general rule of thumb, the longer the time it takes to brew the coffee, the more coarse the grind size is going to be. On both ends of the spectrum, if you're brewing espresso, the contact time with the coffee is relatively short and obviously you're using a highly pressurized system, so you want the grind size to be very, very fine. On the other hand, if you're making cold brew coffee overnight or using a French press and brewing it for 10 to 15 minutes, then using a much coarser grind size is what you'll be after. Medium grind size is a very wide spectrum, so something like an AeroPress, a V60, a Chemex or a mocha pot will have varying degrees of grind size depending on what you're using. The key is to have a look and research which grind size you're after for your particular brewing method and try and dial in from there. Something like a mocha pot or an AeroPress is going to be using a smaller grind size than a V60, for example, because of the shorter contact time and the higher pressure that's being used to brew the coffee. This can make a huge difference to the way your coffee tastes and effectively will stop you from over or under extracting the coffee, which will result in really bitter, nasty tasting coffee or under extracted, weak or sometimes sour tasting coffee, neither of which you really want in the morning. Okay, the fifth and final final way that you can help improve your coffee brewing technique in the morning is actually a number of different tips rolled into one, which I'm going to call serving and storage tips. Now, there's a few different things you can do to help prepare your cup, be that a travel mug or a simple coffee cup, and store your coffee to make it as fresh as possible and ready to use. So in terms of serving, what I'd recommend is pre-warming your coffee cup if you can. So pouring a bit of hot water into it and swirling it around to start with. You're not going to have all of the heat from the hot water that you pour onto your coffee grounds taken away by a cold cup. So you're going to maximize the extraction of the coffee flavors and oils from the coffee grounds and into your cup. Whilst we're on the topic of hot water, I'd actually recommend waiting for your kettle to come just off the boil before pouring it over the coffee grounds. This is such an easy tip that will make a huge difference to the way your coffee tastes, because you're going to minimize the chances of burning your coffee grounds and making it taste bitter and horrible. You can obviously get temperature controlled kettles, but even if you're using a standard kettle, give it 30 seconds or so after it's actually boiled to let it come down a few degrees, and you'll notice a big difference in the way your coffee tastes. Also, if you're drinking instant coffee, adding a bit of cold water into the bottom of your cup will help you minimize the chances of burning that as well. In terms of storage, I'd recommend storing your coffee in a cool, dark cupboard. You can obviously store in the fridge or the freezer, but the fridge is not the best place to store as it can get quite moist, and the temperature change when you open and close the door will not help preserve the freshness of your coffee. If you're going to store coffee in a cold place, I'd recommend storing doses of whole beans in the freezer. This will help maximize the freshness, and then you can take out a dosing tube and grind just before you're going to brew. If that's too much effort, then simply storing your coffee in a cool, dark cupboard is the best way to go. So, whilst none of these tips are going to make you an absolute master barista overnight, they are going to help you reduce your errors and make sure that you brew coffee in the best way possible for you. Hopefully these tips are useful for you, and if you want to find out more about how you can get the best out of your morning brew, I'd recommend heading over to espressoinsiders.com. You can also submit your email address and you'll get a free PDF download of 15 mistakes that you want to avoid when you're making coffee, and this will give you a cheat sheet of how to make the most out of your morning brew. Okay, so I hope you found that useful. If you want to follow me on social media, it's at Espresso Insiders, so drop me a follow and a like. It's greatly appreciated, and I'll see you on the next one.